Yesterday we were talking about the looking back at the irregularities and the questions surrounding this election. Now we're preparing for what's to come with the Biden administration, but I want to underscore this because some people have said, when do you move on? Well, I think we move on when we've addressed the questions that remain from this election. Because if we don't address them, we're going to be facing the same challenges 2 years from now, 4 years from now. Now, I speak to this. I've mentioned this before. Back in 1996 when I was in office and I was managing a Senate campaign in my home state, we had voter fraud. We tried to challenge it. The Senate was the final arbiter. They didn't have the stomach for the fight. But as a member of the legislature, we worked. We went back. The 2 years following that election, we were able to change our election laws and clean up our state. That's what we're doing here. We got to look at what happened. How did this occur? And what do we need to do to fix it? And one of the areas that I have seen that I think is probably one of the most significant is what our guest yesterday was talking about, Phill Kline. He's the director of the Amistad Project of the non-partisan Thomas More Society, former Attorney General for the state of Kansas. And this is about a group that is called the Center for Tech and Civic Life. And they gave grants to more than 2,500 election jurisdictions. It was a private-public partnership that, well, it appears to have crossed the line. If not, it certainly should be for future elections. Joining me now to continue our conversation is Phill Kline. Phill, thanks so much for joining us again today.
You bet, Tony. Thank you. And you are so right. We can't move on until we understand what occurred and prevent it from ever happening.
And so let's start. And I just want to very quickly recap, and then I'm going to get into some new territory. But this group funded by Mark Zuckerberg. It was a nonprofit that in the past had very little money. They received over $350 million from Zuckerberg, and they gave out over 2,500 grants to election offices to facilitate this election. Now, has this ever happened before?
No, not at all. And in fact, in total, Zuckerberg gave $419 million to various nonprofits, joined by money from Google, the Skoll Foundation, the Arabella Fund, a lot of the left funding organizations. It went well over $500 million. And the federal government in March of 2020, Tony, passed a law called the CARES Act. That was our COVID relief that first passed.
Right.
And they provided $400 million to run the election during the pandemic, and Mark Zuckerberg alone exceeded that.
And in some cases, these grants actually eclipsed the operating budgets of these government agencies.
Oh, absolutely. And they didn't need the fund. They actually had funds remaining from what the federal government provided. So CTCL, so Zuckerberg gives this money to the Center for Tech and Civic Life, and they started administering those grants consistent with the playbook written by David Plouffe, Obama's former campaign manager, who was working for Zuckerberg in March of 2020 when he published a book entitled A Citizen's Guide to Defeating Donald Trump. And on page 81 of that book, he writes about the block-by-block street fight that needs to occur in the urban core to turn out the vote. And so what Zuckerberg's money did is CTCL, which is run by Tiana Epps, who is also a former Obama fellow, provided these monies to Democrat officials within the cities. Now, what's important to recognize is that the federal law, the Help America Vote Act, requires states, and this is wise, to treat every voter equally. So does the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. And so they require funding to be somewhat on an equal level, giving everybody an equal opportunity to vote, because we witnessed back at the turn of the 20th century in the Deep South the effort of government to suppress the black vote and to increase the white vote. And of course, that can't happen in America on any basis. But what we saw this election was the Democratic Party using the same tactic with different demographics. They targeted Democrat strongholds to turn out the vote with government action.
Give us examples of that. So we, because that's one of the things
Sure.
that the left is saying. Well, you're just making these allegations. You're not providing any evidence. So let our listeners hear exactly the type of activity that took place.
Let's go to Philadelphia and Delaware County, Pennsylvania. Delaware County is a suburb, but primarily Democrat stronghold. And, of course, Philadelphia is overwhelmingly Democratic. They received early money and millions of dollars from the Zuckerberg-funded charity. And in the grant, and we obtained this pursuant to court order because they're not providing any of this information. Mm-hmm. In the grant, they dictate the number of polling places that Philadelphia is going to have. They say you're going to increase polling locations from 190 to 800. And Philadelphia responds and says, we can do that, and we believe that's going to increase voter turnout during the pandemic, by the way, by 100 or 25% to 33%. Now, if you take Philadelphia historical voting trends, that means another 140,000 votes for Biden in a state that Trump won by 80,000 votes in 2016. So they had 800 locations for people to vote. Plus, in Delaware County, they had the Zuckerberg drop boxes, which were fraught with fraud because they didn't maintain chain of custody. It breached the chain of custody of the ballot. But they had enough drop boxes that one was placed every 4 square miles. Plus, they had mobile pickup ballot units. Now, this is government doing this. Mm-hmm. And they had inducement. They gave away gifts for people to show up and vote. And so you could walk out and stroll down the street and vote in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, or you could wait for somebody to pick up your ballot, or you can go vote at one of several hundred locations and get a free umbrella and some food and things. In Trump country, in the 59 counties that Trump won, the Democrat governor consolidated in-person polling places, making it less numerous than before, and there was one drop box for every 1,159 square miles.
Wow.
So if you lived out in Republican strongholds, you had to go on a weekend vacation and find Waldo to vote. And in Philadelphia, it was almost impossible not to vote.
Now, let me add to this. I was, I've been reading about this, and this comes from NPR. Okay, so certainly not a conservative news outlet, but they were doing a story. They did a story, to their credit. Of course, they slanted the direction they wanted. They did a story on the Center for Tech and Civic Life and the grants that they gave. In Pennsylvania, Chester County, and I'm quoting from this piece, Chester County is one of several large suburban counties that ring Philadelphia, once Republican strongholds that have shifted in Democrats' favor in recent years. Pennsylvania was pivotal to Joe Biden's victory over President Trump, and his win in the state was fueled in part by his success in Chester County. He won it by 17 percentage points, nearly double Hillary Clinton's margin 4 years earlier. The nonprofit gave Chester County $2.5 million for the election, which is more than the county's 2020 budget for voting services, end quote. It's right there.
Yes, and Chester County was also just a gold mine of what's called the undervote. And you know this, Tony, from your elections, that Hillary Clinton had a significant undervote than Obama. Obama greatly outperformed Hillary Clinton in Chester County. So they saw the opportunity to go there and reclaim those Obama voters for Biden. And that's what they did. You saw, if you took the Center for Tech and Civic Life game plan in April, May, and June and July, before they got late in the election and they got some criticism and they started sprinkling small monies to Republican areas, it was the game plan written by David Plouffe. And it was a very, very targeted. In fact, they hired agents, for example, to go into Louisiana and contact 13 of the parishes and say, you meet our demographics. Come receive money from us. We'll give you money to draft grant agreements. They went into Wisconsin, into Racine and Madison and Green Bay and Milwaukee and said, look, we want you to get this money. So we're going to help build a plan. And that plan was contrary to state law and contrary to federal law. So at every place that Zuckerberg money touched in the urban core, you saw these irregularities. They consolidated counting centers. Now, they said, typically, Tony, when you're talking about counting the vote, handling the ballots and curing ballots and counting the ballots, you're talking about a fairly small facility where everybody can see what's going on, and the law requires bipartisan presence. Instead, they consolidated the counting centers, and that accomplished two things. Now, they claimed it was because of COVID, but they created crowds. You don't bring a bunch of people to one location because of COVID. And they consolidated the counting centers. That allowed the flow of hundreds of thousands of ballots to one location. It enabled the late-night ballot drops. And it also allowed them to claim they were technically complying with the law that required a Republican to be present at the place of the counting.
Right.
But in Wayne County, Detroit, they put them in the cheap seats in a room that is the size of 2 football fields, and he couldn't see what was happening.
Wow.
They did that in every one of these cities.
So
it's real interesting. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I want to be perfectly clear here when we use terminology, because I think one of the criticisms that I've heard is, we talk about voter fraud. What we're talking about here, where they're legally casting a ballot under a system that's been manipulated, that's not a fraudulent vote. And so the issue here is, did the officials adhere to the law? It wasn't the people that were casting the votes. It was those that were overseeing the elections.
Yes, and they violated the law, and admittedly so.
Right.
In all of these
okay.
states.
We're going to run we're going to run out of time here, because this is I asked this question at the last moment yesterday. How do we fix this? How is this fixed?
Well, first of all, America's got to stand up and say, look, the best prophylactic measure in the United States is transparency. And so there's reason there are laws that require both parties to be present at all times when you're managing ballots. We need to honor that. Secondly, we need to go to paper. We need to go to paper, and we need what's called risk-limiting audits and eliminate far in advance without excuse absentee balloting.
And what about
vote on election day? You can have voting.
And what about the issue of this private money going in to fund public elections?
It should never happen. You can't have elections brought to you by Coca-Cola, the Koch brothers, the NRA, or Mark Zuckerberg.
Is that the role of the federal government to address that issue?
I think it's the role of everybody. I believe it is contrary to law now. I do believe that. But it is certainly state legislatures and the federal government.
But we've not seen judges willing to take these cases up.
Well, the cases still exist. We couldn't get TROs.
Right.
And so our cases, the challenge is that we weren't able to get to trial to have discovery and obtain evidence prior to the election being done. So we still have cases on file. We plan to try them, and we plan to initiate discovery.
Well,
and we're going to get to the bottom of this.
Good. As I said, this is about the future, even more so than about the past. We cannot let this go, because if we do, we'll never have confidence in another election in America. Phill Kline, thanks so much for joining us, and I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thank you, sir.